The taste of chocolate was the last thing Private Tanaka expected to encounter in the jungles of New Guinea. His hands trembled as he tore open the small brown package. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, sat a Hershey's bar alongside crackers that weren't moldy, cheese that wasn't rancid, and cigarettes that weren't dampened by endless tropical rain. For 7 days, 200 Japanese soldiers ate like this. American rations, enemy food, each meal a reminder of everything their own command had promised but never delivered. On the 8th day, they vanished into the jungle, not toward enemy lines, but away from their own. This is the story of the desertion that Imperial Command tried to erase from history, and how chocolate bars became more powerful than any weapon the Allies could deploy. New Guinea, 1943. The forgotten front of the Pacific War. While Americans back home followed the island-hopping campaigns with pins on maps, the real war was being fought in places that didn't even have names, just grid coordinates on military charts. Jungles so dense that soldiers could pass within 10 feet of each other and never know it. Rain that fell not in drops, but in sheets, turning the ground into a sucking morass that could swallow a man up to his knees. The Japanese 18th Army was starving, not the romantic kind of hunger soldiers write about in memoirs. The kind that makes men's teeth fall out from scurvy. The kind that turns skin yellow and makes bones visible through flesh. The kind that drove soldiers to strip bark from trees and boil their leather belts for something, anything, to fill their stomachs. Imperial doctrine was clear. The Japanese soldier required only 2,000 calories per day. Rice, pickled vegetables, and miso soup. Simple, efficient. Except the supply ships weren't arriving. American submarines prowled the waters between Rabaul and the forward positions, sending transport after transport to the bottom of the Pacific. The planes that might have airdropped supplies were needed elsewhere, for kamikaze missions, for defending the homeland. The soldiers understood. Gammon, endurance, perseverance. It was the Japanese way, until they tasted what American soldiers ate every single day. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka wasn't supposed to be in New Guinea at all. He'd been a schoolteacher in Osaka. Mathematics. He loved watching his students' faces light up when they finally understood a difficult concept. He had soft hands, wire-rimmed glasses that were always sliding down his nose, and a gentle disposition that made him popular with parents and children alike. The draft notice came in 1942. By early 1943, he was waist-deep in a New Guinea swamp, his glasses long since broken and discarded, his soft hands now calloused and covered in jungle rot that wouldn't heal. Tanaka kept a diary. Against regulations, against common sense. Paper was precious, and getting caught with personal writings could mean severe punishment. But he wrote anyway, in tiny characters in the margins of military documents he was supposed to file. Those fragments survived the war, donated to a university archive by his widow 60 years later. "We received half rations again today," he wrote in March 1943. "Nakamura-san died last night. Beriberi. We barely had the strength to bury him. The sergeant says we must endure. I wonder what my students are eating for lunch." The 18th Army had been promised resupply. "Any day now," the officers said. "Hold your positions. Maintain discipline. The Emperor is watching." But the Emperor was very far away, and hunger has a way of drowning out even the most fervent patriotism. The American position they stumbled upon was abandoned. Not freshly abandoned, no warm food, no weapons carelessly left behind. The Americans had pulled back 3 days earlier, part of a tactical repositioning that Japanese intelligence somehow hadn't detected. They'd been thorough, taking their heavy equipment, destroying what couldn't be transported. But in their haste, or perhaps in their abundance, they'd left something behind. Crates of K-rations. Dozens of them stacked under tarps that hadn't quite protected them from the rain. Some damaged, some intact. Enough food for 200 men for a week, maybe more if they were careful. Captain Yoshida faced an impossible decision. The regulations were explicit. Captured enemy supplies were to be reported to division headquarters immediately and secured for official distribution. Taking them without authorization was theft. Consuming them without permission was dereliction of duty. The penalty for either could be severe, demotion, imprisonment, or worse. But Yoshida looked at his men. 200 walking skeletons in tattered uniforms. He'd lost 47 soldiers in the past month, not to combat but to disease and starvation. The survivors moved like old men, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and deliberate to conserve energy. The nearest radio was 6 miles away, at battalion headquarters. 6 miles through terrain that took a full day to traverse. By the time permission came through, if it came through, the food might be looted by other desperate units, or ruined by the rain, or devoured by jungle rats. Yoshida made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Distribute the rations," he ordered. 1 package per man per day. We'll report it when the radio operator makes his next scheduled contact. Nobody questioned the order. They were too busy tearing open the boxes. Tanaka's hands shook as he examined his first K-ration. The package itself was a marvel. Waxed cardboard, completely waterproof. He'd been carrying wet rice in a cloth bag that rotted and grew fungus within days. This was engineered, designed. Someone in America had thought carefully about how to keep food fresh in terrible conditions. Inside, a can of meat, cheese spread, crackers that were actually crispy, powdered coffee, sugar tablets, cigarettes, matches that worked even in humidity, chewing gum, toilet paper. Tanaka almost laughed, almost cried. They'd been using leaves for months, often getting secondary infections from the plants they chose. But it was the chocolate that broke something inside him. He bit into the Hershey's bar slowly, letting it melt on his tongue. It had been 2 years since he'd tasted sugar. The sweetness was almost painful. His eyes watered. From the chocolate, he told himself, not from anything else. Around him, 200 men experienced the same revelation. They ate methodically that first day, savoring every bite. The crackers alone were better than anything they'd eaten in months. The canned meat, labeled pork and beans, was hot when opened somehow, and tasted like a feast. The coffee was strong enough to clear the fog from their minds. By the second day, they noticed something else. Their strength was returning. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but noticeably. Men who'd been too weak to carry their rifles could shoulder them again. The constant dizzy spells diminished. Wounds that had festered for weeks started to heal. By the third day, they were no longer thinking like Japanese soldiers. They were thinking like men who'd been betrayed. "The Americans feed their soldiers this," Corporal Sato said, examining an empty can. "Every day. This is their standard ration. Not special occasion food. Not officers' privileges. Standard." The implications hung in the humid air. The Japanese command had told them they were fighting a decadent enemy. Soft Americans who couldn't endure hardship. Weak-willed soldiers who would crumble under the righteous fury of the Imperial Army. But soft enemies didn't design rations this good. Weak-willed soldiers didn't fight this effectively. The Americans they'd faced were well-fed, well-equipped, and very, very difficult to kill. While Japanese soldiers ate bark and roots, American soldiers ate chocolate and cheese. By the fourth day, conversations that would have been unthinkable a week earlier were happening in whispers. My brother's unit was told the same thing. Supplies coming any day. They waited 3 months. Half of them died. The officers eat better than we do. Have you noticed? They're not thin. I heard the Americans sometimes throw away food because they have too much. Tanaka wrote in his diary, "We have been lied to. I cannot write what I truly think, because if these words are found, I will be shot. But chocolate has shown me the truth. We are not fighting for victory. We are dying for nothing." By the 5th day, Captain Yoshida knew he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Not in feeding his men, that was the humane choice, possibly the only choice, but in letting them taste what their enemy considered ordinary. In letting them experience, even briefly, what proper logistics looked like, what competent command provided. The men were recovering physically. But mentally, something had shattered. The absolute faith in imperial command, the certainty that their suffering had meaning, the belief that endurance alone would lead to victory. You can't unfeed a starving man. You can't show him abundance and expect him to happily return to starvation. By the 6th day, 3 men deserted. They slipped away during the night, taking their rifles but leaving everything else. Yoshida had them marked as killed in action. What else could he do? Report that well-fed soldiers had abandoned their posts? Admit that enemy rations had accomplished what no American offensive could? By the 7th day, the food was gone. That last evening, the men sat in silence, staring at empty waxed cardboard boxes. Tomorrow, they'd return to half rations of moldy rice. Tomorrow, the hunger would come back. Worse than before because now they knew exactly what they were missing. Tomorrow, they'd remember that they were expendable. On the 8th day, Captain Yoshida woke to find his command nearly empty. Not completely. About 40 men remained. The loyalists, the ones too afraid to leave, or too indoctrinated, or too sick to move. But the others, 160 soldiers, had vanished into the jungle. No shots fired, no confrontation. They simply melted away, like morning mist. Yoshida sat in his tent, staring at the report he was supposed to file. How did you explain this? How did you write, "My men ate enemy rations and lost faith in the emperor," in military language that wouldn't get you executed? He burned his first 3 drafts. The final report read, "Night attack by Allied forces. Heavy casualties, units scattered, regrouping at secondary position." Division headquarters accepted the report without question. Units were being scattered and destroyed across New Guinea every week. What was one more? But Yoshida knew the truth. The Americans hadn't scattered his unit. Chocolate had. The deserters left in small groups, heading in different directions. Some tried to surrender to American forces, though language barriers and trigger-happy sentries made that nearly impossible. Several were shot approaching Allied lines with their hands up. Others went native, disappearing into the deep jungle. Villages in the interior would later report Japanese soldiers living among them, men who'd removed their uniforms and chose to take their chances with malaria and headhunters rather than return to their own army. A few tried to steal boats and sail north, hoping to reach neutral territory. Most drowned. But the largest group, nearly 80 men, did something unprecedented in the Pacific War. They formed their own unit. Not fighting for Japan, not fighting for America, just surviving. They raided both Japanese and Allied supply lines with equal opportunity. They built hidden camps deep in the jungle. They traded with natives, offering captured weapons for food and medicine. They became ghosts, rumors. When the war ended in 1945, most of them surrendered to Australian forces, expecting execution. Instead, they were processed as standard POWs. The victors were too busy dealing with millions of displaced soldiers to investigate every irregular unit. Tanaka was among them. He survived the war, returned to Japan in 1946, and never taught again. He became a clerk in a Tokyo office, spoke rarely about his service, and died in 1989. His diary wasn't discovered until his widow donated his effects to a university in 2003. The mass desertion from Captain Yoshida's unit never appeared in official Japanese military records. Division headquarters maintained the fiction of an Allied attack. Yoshida himself was killed in action 3 months later, legitimately this time, leading a suicidal charge against an American machine gun nest. Whether it was bravery or shame that drove him forward, nobody knew. But the incident wasn't isolated. American and Australian intelligence officers began noticing a pattern in late 1943 and throughout 1944. Japanese units that captured substantial quantities of Allied rations had significantly higher desertion rates. Not immediately, but within 2 weeks of consuming them. The pattern was so consistent that some Allied commanders began intentionally leaving rations behind during tactical withdrawals. Psychological warfare without firing a shot. Let the enemy see how the other side lived. Let them taste abundance. Let them ask themselves why they were dying in a jungle for leaders who couldn't even feed them properly. The Japanese command eventually caught on. New orders went out in early 1944. Captured enemy supplies were to be destroyed immediately, not consumed. Any soldier found with American rations faced court-martial. But by then, it was too late. The secret was out. Japanese soldiers across the Pacific Theater knew the truth. They shared it in whispers, in coded letters home, in desperate conversations, in jungle foxholes. The Americans had so much food they could afford to leave it behind. The Americans treated their soldiers like valuable assets, not expendable tools. The morale impact was incalculable. Logistics won the Pacific War. Not battleships, not island invasions, not even the atomic bombs. The unglamorous, uncinematic reality of supply chains and quartermaster reports. The Americans could project force across the world's largest ocean and still feed their soldiers chocolate bars. The Japanese couldn't reliably feed troops a few hundred miles from their own territory. Every K-ration package was a little propaganda bomb, more effective than any leaflet drop. It said, "Your command is failing you. The enemy treats its soldiers better than your own officers do. You're dying for nothing." 200 men deserted because of 1 week of American rations. How many others had the same thought but lacked the courage to act on it? How many Japanese soldiers fought with less conviction because they knew, somewhere in their starving bodies, that they'd been abandoned by their own leadership? There's a photograph that survived the war, tucked into Private Tanaka's diary. It shows an empty K-ration box, carefully flattened and pressed between pages. On the back, in tiny characters, Tanaka had written, "This fed me better for 1 day than my country fed me for 1 month. I no longer know who the enemy is." The Japanese soldiers who deserted after eating American rations weren't cowards. They were men who'd been asked to die for a cause that wouldn't even provide them basic sustenance. They were soldiers who'd been promised glory but given only suffering. And when they tasted how the other side lived, not luxury, just competence, they made a rational decision. The chocolate didn't make them soft. It made them see clearly. In war, we talk about weapons and tactics, strategies and battles. But sometimes the most powerful weapon is something simpler, showing your enemy that they deserve better than what their own side provides. 200 Japanese soldiers deserted because someone fed them. Think about what that says. About leadership, about logistics, about the lies we tell soldiers to keep them fighting. And think about how many wars might have ended differently if both sides had simply taken care of their own people first. The next time someone tells you war is about ideology or honor or duty, remember this. Sometimes it's just about whether your command cares enough to keep you from starving. Japan lost the Pacific War in many ways, on many islands, in countless battles. But they also lost it one chocolate bar at a time.